Emily stepped out of her apartment into the crisp Parisian air, her yellow winter coat bright against the grey sky. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the heavens, blanketing the cobblestone streets in a shimmering white. She clutched her gloves tighter as she made her way to the ice rink by the Seine, a favourite winter escape. The rink buzzed with life. Children giggled as they stumbled, couples glided hand in hand, and the occasional daring skater twirled in the centre. Emily wasn't a skater, not really, but she loved the atmosphere, the laughter, the joy, and the magic of winter. She stood at the edge, sipping a cup of hot chocolate she'd bought from a nearby stall. Her eyes wandered across the rink until they settled on a man. He wasn't the best skater, far from it, actually, but something about his determination made her smile. Every time he fell, he laughed, brushing snow off his coat before trying again. His dark hair was messy from his tumbles, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and caught her eye. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, the chatter and music fading into the background. Then he grinned, a lopsided, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Emily blushed and turned back to her drink, but it was too late. He'd skated, or stumbled toward the edge. "Bonjour," he said, slightly out of breath. His accent revealed he wasn't a local. "Bonjour," Emily replied, smiling despite herself. "I think you're better at watching than I am at skating," he said, his voice carrying a mix of charm and humour. She laughed. "You're not bad. Persistent, at least." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said, brushing snow off his knees. "I'm Lucas. Care to join me out there? I could use a lesson, or maybe just someone to catch me when I fall." Emily hesitated, glancing at the rink. Then, emboldened by his easy demeanour, she set down her drink and tugged on her gloves. "Why not? But no promises on catching you." As they stepped onto the ice, their laughter blended into the winter air. Emily wobbled slightly as she stepped onto the ice, the skates feeling foreign beneath her. Lucas extended his hand, a teasing grin tugging at his lips. "Don't worry, I'm an expert at falling. If we both go down, I promise to cushion the landing." She chuckled but took his hand, his warmth seeping through their gloves. "I'll hold you to that." They started slow, gliding cautiously, her steps tentative while his were downright chaotic. Lucas's confidence clearly outpaced his skill, and Emily couldn't help but laugh as he flailed to keep his balance. It wasn't long before his feet betrayed him and he landed with an unceremonious thud on the ice, dragging Emily down with him. The two burst into laughter, their breath misting in the cold air. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "Told you I'd take you down with me." "Good thing I don't scare easily," Emily replied, still giggling. She reached for his arm to help him up, but their skates tangled, sending them both back onto the ice in another heap. This time, their laughter turned into gasping fits. Around them, other skaters chuckled at the sight, and even Emily's usual self-consciousness melted away. "Okay," Lucas said between breaths. "Maybe we're better off sticking to the edge." Emily nodded, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and perhaps something more. They shuffled to the rink's border, gripping the railing like children learning to walk. As they found their rhythm, they began to talk. Lucas told her he was an illustrator from London, in Paris for a short holiday to recharge. Emily shared snippets of her life, how she worked at a small bookstore near Montmartre, and came to the rink when she needed inspiration. Time seemed to slip away as they skated in circles, their laughter and conversation weaving a connection between them. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ice, Lucas turned to her. "Would you let me take you to dinner? After all, you've already saved my life out here at least twice." Emily smiled, her heart fluttering. "I'd like that." The evening deepened as Emily and Lucas walked side by side along the snow-dusted streets of Paris. The ice rink had faded into the background, replaced by the warm glow of streetlights and the inviting chatter of nearby cafes. Emily still felt the buzz of the rink, her heart beating just a little faster than usual. They ended up at a small bistro tucked away on a quiet street, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Lucas held the door open for her, and as they stepped in, the cosy atmosphere wrapped around them like a blanket. Candles flickered on the tables, and the scent of fresh bread and hearty stews filled the air. "This is perfect," Emily said, sliding into a booth by the window. She tugged off her gloves and placed them on the table, her cheeks still rosy from the cold. "Glad you think so," Lucas replied, his smile disarming as he settled across from her. "I figured a Parisian like you might have high standards." "Well," she said, with a playful tilt of her head, "you're off to a good start." They ordered simple dishes, warm onion soup for her, coq au vin for him, and as the meal unfolded, so did their conversation. Lucas had a knack for storytelling, and Emily found herself leaning in, captivated by tales of his adventures illustrating children's books, his love for travel, and the way he always seemed to find humour in life's mishaps. When it was Emily's turn, she shared stories about her bookstore and the people she met there, her voice lighting up as she talked about her favourite novels, and the way Paris always felt like a story waiting to be written. "I think you're a storyteller too," Lucas said, his gaze steady. "Even if you don't know it yet." Emily felt a blush creep up her neck. Maybe, or maybe I just needed the right person to listen. Their conversation lingered long after their plates were empty, and when the waiter gently hinted it was closing time, they stepped back into the snowy night. Lucas turned to her, brushing a snowflake from her hair. "Can I see you again?" Emily smiled, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "I'd like that." The days that followed felt like a dream, the kind of serendipitous magic Emily thought only existed in books. Lucas stayed in Paris longer than planned, postponing his return to London with the easy excuse of needing more creative inspiration. They spent their mornings exploring the city, their afternoons sipping coffee in quaint cafes, and their evenings walking beneath strings of twinkling lights. Emily found herself looking forward to each moment with him. He had a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, pointing out a peculiar gargoyle on a cathedral or inventing a silly story about a pigeon they passed. With Lucas, even the greyest winter days felt alive. One afternoon, Lucas surprised her by arriving at her bookstore, a sketchpad tucked under his arm. Emily was helping an elderly woman choose a novel when she spotted him standing near the window, sketching intently. "Is that supposed to be me?" she asked when she approached, trying to peek over his shoulder. He snapped the book shut with a mischievous grin. "Maybe, or maybe it's a mysterious woman in a yellow coat who keeps stealing my attention." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "True," he said, leaning slightly closer, "but you seem to tolerate me." She blushed, hiding her smile by pretending to straighten a stack of books. "What are you doing here anyway?" "I figured this is where you feel most at home," Lucas said, his tone softening, "and I wanted to see you in your world." Emily's heart fluttered. She wasn't used to someone noticing her so deeply, let alone making her feel like she was worth noticing. Later that evening, they ended up back at the ice rink, their laughter echoing in the cold air as they skated together under the stars. Emily felt her walls melting, the quiet life she had built around herself opening to make space for something new, something wonderful. As they sat on a bench afterward, their hands brushing lightly, Lucas turned to her. "Do you think Paris feels different this winter?" Emily looked at him, her heart full. "It does now." The weeks unfolded like chapters in a novel Emily never wanted to end. Each day brought something new, a corner of Paris she had overlooked, a shared laugh that stayed with her long after, or a moment where silence between them felt as meaningful as words. One evening, as snow softly fell over the city, Lucas suggested they visit Montmartre. "Show me where you get your inspiration," he said, his smile warm against the chill in the air. Emily led him to a hilltop cafe that overlooked the city. Inside, they found a table near the window, and Lucas immediately pulled out his sketchpad. "Don't move," he said, studying her intently. "I'm not a model, Lucas," Emily protested, though her cheeks flushed. "You're better," he replied without hesitation, his pencil moving across the page. "You're real." She watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration, the faint scratch of graphite on paper filling the space between them. For a moment, she let herself imagine what life with Lucas might look like, a future filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and quiet moments like this. When he finally turned the pad around, Emily gasped. He had drawn her not as she sat in the cafe, but as she was at the rink that first night, bundled in her yellow coat, snowflakes caught in her hair, her face lit with laughter. "It's how I first saw you," Lucas explained. The moment I knew there was something about you." Emily looked at him, her chest tightening. No one had ever seen her like this, let alone captured it so beautifully. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Lucas—" "Shh," he interrupted, his grin playful. "I'm supposed to be the dramatic one here." She laughed, her emotions swirling like the snow outside. Later, as they stood on the hilltop watching Paris sparkle below, Lucas slipped his arm around her. "Emily," he said quietly, "meeting you has made this winter the best of my life." Emily turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "You've made mine brighter than I ever thought it could be." Then, under the Parisian stars, she kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, a hesitant exploration under the canopy of stars, but as the lights of Paris twinkled below and the quiet of the snowy evening wrapped around them, Emily felt something shift deep within her, a quiet certainty that she hadn't felt in years. When they finally pulled apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with the cold air. "You've officially ruined London for me," he murmured, a teasing smile playing on his lips. Emily laughed, her cheeks warming despite the chill. "I thought you were only here for inspiration." "I didn't know inspiration had a name," he said, his gaze locking with hers. Her heart fluttered and she shook her head. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," he admitted, "but you like me anyway." She couldn't argue with that. Together they walked hand in hand back down the hill, the world around them quiet save for the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Paris felt different now. Warmer, alive in a way she hadn't noticed before Lucas. As they neared her apartment, the street lamps cast a golden glow over the snowy path. Lucas stopped just outside her door, his expression soft. "Emily, I've been thinking about something." She tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" He hesitated for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want this to just be a chapter. I want it to be the whole book." Her breath caught. "Lucas, I know it's fast," he continued, his voice earnest. "But I've never felt this way before. You make me feel like I can be myself, like all the stories I've been trying to tell suddenly make sense." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, protecting it from the fear of being hurt. But with Lucas, it felt effortless to let them crumble. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "Then let's write it together." His face lit up, and as he pulled her into another kiss, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a perfect magical stillness. As they stood in the falling snow, lost in the magic of the moment, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. But just as Lucas kissed her forehead, a distant sound broke the tranquility. The faint buzz of a phone vibrating in his pocket made her step back, their shared warmth interrupted. Lucas sighed, pulling out his phone. "I'm sorry. I thought I silenced it." He glanced at the screen and Emily saw his expression change. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something heavier. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Lucas hesitated, his thumb hovering over the phone. Finally, he sighed and showed her the screen. A name flashed across it. Clara. Below it, a message preview read, "Call me. We need to talk." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Who's Clara?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Lucas looked away, his hands slipping into his coat pockets. "She's someone I was seeing before I came here." Emily's breath caught. "Seeing? As in a girlfriend?" "It's complicated," Lucas said, his voice strained. "We were together, but things weren't working. I came to Paris to clear my head, to figure things out, and then I met you." Her chest tightened further. "Lucas, were you honest with me? Is it really over between you two?" He stepped toward her, urgency in his voice. "Emily, meeting you wasn't part of any plan. You've turned everything upside down in the best way. I know how this looks, but Clara and I were done long before I met you. I just haven't told her yet." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to believe him, to cling to the connection they had built, but another part recoiled, unsure if she could trust him. "You should go," she said quietly, crossing her arms as the cold suddenly felt sharper. "Emily, please." "Go," she repeated, her voice firmer. "Figure out your past before you come into my future." Lucas hesitated, his expression pained, but eventually turned and walked away. Emily stood there, her yellow coat stark against the snowy street, watching his silhouette fade into the night. The days that followed were quiet, colder somehow, even though the winter sun continued to rise over Paris as always. Emily buried herself in work at the bookstore, rearranging shelves and recommending novels to customers with a forced smile. But the magic she had felt with Lucas lingered, casting a shadow she couldn't shake. Each time the bell above the door chimed, her heart leapt, only to sink when it wasn't him. She tried to rationalise her feelings. After all, they'd only known each other for a short time. But the connection had felt real, tangible, and losing it left her hollow. One evening, as she locked up the shop, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the frame of the door. Curious, she opened it. "Emily, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let you find out that way. Clara and I were over, but I hadn't been brave enough to close the chapter properly. After you told me to leave, I went back to London and finally ended things the way I should have months ago. She deserved honesty just as you do. I don't know if you'll forgive me, but I had to try. I'll be at the rink tomorrow evening, hoping you'll give me one more chance. If you don't come, I'll understand." Lucas. Emily's hands trembled as she read the note again. She felt torn. Part of her wanted to stay in the safety of her routine, to avoid the risk of being hurt again. But the other part, the one that had laughed with Lucas in the snow and skated clumsily at his side, whispered that maybe some chances were worth taking. The next evening, she found herself standing at the edge of the rink, her yellow coat vivid against the evening light. Lucas was there, pacing nervously on the ice, his scarf crooked and his hair dishevelled. When he saw her, his eyes lit up with relief and hope. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I almost didn't," Emily replied, her heart racing. "But maybe I'm ready to write a new chapter too." And with that, she stepped onto the ice. As Emily stepped onto the ice, her skates wobbled slightly, but Lucas was already there, extending his hand. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, his touch familiar yet tentative, as if he was afraid to push her too far. "I don't deserve this," he admitted quietly, his voice almost lost in the hum of the rink. "But I promise, if you let me, I'll spend every day proving I'm worth it." Emily's eyes met his, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was the same warmth that had drawn her to him in the first place. "You made a mistake," she said, her tone measured, "but what matters is what you do next." Lucas nodded, his grip on her hand tightening just slightly. "What I want to do next is skate with you, just that. No promises I can't keep, no pressure, just us." She smiled, the weight in her chest lifting a little. "Then let's start with that." They began moving slowly, Emily's initial nervousness fading as they found a steady rhythm. The rink was quieter than usual, the soft strains of music drifting through the crisp winter air. Around them, the city's lights twinkled like stars, reflected in the glassy ice. As they skated, Lucas began to speak. He told her about the conversation he'd had with Clara, how he'd apologised for his mistakes, owned up to the way he'd left things unresolved, and ended it for good. He didn't sugarcoat his flaws, didn't try to excuse his actions, and Emily found herself appreciating his honesty, even if it stung to hear. By the time they reached the far edge of the rink, Emily felt lighter. "You're not perfect," she said softly, her breath visible in the cold air. "But neither am I. Maybe that's why this could work." Lucas stopped, turning to face her. "Does that mean I get another chance?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "It means we'll see where this takes us." And for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope warming her from within as they skated on into the night. As Emily stepped out onto the ice, the world seemed to still. The chatter of the rink faded into the background, leaving only the soft glide of skates and the gentle music drifting through the air. Lucas stood there, waiting for her, his breath misting in the cold. When their eyes met, a flicker of relief and longing crossed his face. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice carrying a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice soft. "But something told me not to let us slip away." His lips curved into a hopeful smile as he extended his hand, palm open. "Then let me prove I deserve to hold on to it." She hesitated for only a moment before sliding her hand into his. His grip was warm, steady, and as their fingers intertwined, Emily felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost: trust. They began skating, their movements tentative at first, but soon they found their rhythm, gliding together as if they'd been doing this forever. The city's lights shimmered around them, and snow began to fall in delicate flakes, catching in Emily's hair like tiny diamonds. Lucas glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you in that yellow coat?" "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you looked like sunshine in the middle of winter," he said. "Like something I didn't know I needed until you were there." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "And what do you see now?" He stopped skating, gently pulling her to a halt in the centre of the rink. Taking both her hands, he leaned closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I see the person who makes everything else fade away, the one I don't want to let go of, no matter what." Emily felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before she could say more, he closed the space between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that melted the winter chill, leaving only warmth and promise in its place. The kiss lingered, soft and tender, as if both were afraid to let it end. When they finally pulled apart, the world seemed brighter, the snow swirling around them like confetti. Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against the cold night air. "I don't want to mess this up," he said quietly. "I'm not perfect, Emily. I'll make mistakes, but I promise I'll always be honest with you from now on." She smiled, her hands still entwined with his. "I don't need perfect, Lucas. I just need real, and with you. It feels real." His grin broke through, wide and genuine. "You have no idea how much that means to me." They skated hand in hand, the rest of the world fading as they talked about everything and nothing. Emily found herself laughing again, the weight in her chest replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Lucas shared stories of his childhood in London, of how his love for drawing had started with doodles on the backs of school notebooks. Emily told him about her quiet childhood in Provence, how books had been her constant companions, and her dream of one day writing her own. As the rink began to empty, the snow falling heavier now, they made their way off the ice. Lucas pulled her close, wrapping his scarf around both of them. "You know," he said, his tone playful, "this might be my favourite winter memory ever." "Even with all the falling?" Emily teased, raising an eyebrow. "Especially with all the falling," he replied, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "It brought me to you." As they walked through the snowy streets back to Emily's apartment, their footsteps in sync, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: contentment. When they reached her door, Lucas hesitated. "I don't want tonight to end." Emily smiled, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him once more. "Then don't let it. Stay, Lucas. Stay in Paris." His eyes lit up and he nodded. "For you, always." And as the snow continued to fall, their story truly began. Winter melted into spring, and with it, Paris awakened in a burst of colour. The snow was gone, replaced by blossoms that lined the cobbled streets. For Emily and Lucas, those months had been transformative, each day a page in a story neither had expected to write. Lucas stayed, as he'd promised, moving into a small flat not far from Emily's bookstore. His days were spent sketching in cafes and parks, his illustrations taking on a warmth and vibrancy that surprised even him. Emily's life at the bookstore shifted too. No longer just a refuge, it became a place where she thrived, sharing her passion for stories with newfound confidence. Their evenings were a mix of quiet moments and adventures, dinners at tucked-away bistros, late-night walks by the Seine, and of course, more trips to the ice rink. Though Lucas's skating never truly improved, his laughter each time he fell was enough to make Emily love the rink even more. One evening, as they strolled along the river, Lucas stopped suddenly. Emily turned, a playful question on her lips, but the look in his eyes silenced her. He took her hands, his voice soft but steady. "You know," he began, "I came to Paris to find inspiration. And I found it, but not in the way I thought. You've made me see the world differently, Emily. Brighter, bigger, like anything is possible as long as you're with me." She opened her mouth to respond, but he pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn sketchbook. He flipped it open to a page in the middle. There, in careful detail, was an illustration of Emily in her yellow coat, standing in a snowy Parisian street, her smile radiant. "I don't have a ring yet," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I have this, and I have a question. Will you let me keep writing this story with you? Will you marry me? Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she looked at the drawing. Then at him, her answer was clear, her voice steady. Yes, always, yes. Under the glow of the city lights they embraced, their story closing one chapter only to begin the next.